In the late summer of 1933, concrete pouring operations at Hoover Dam, then called Boulder Dam by the workers who were dying building it, stopped for 11 days. The official record gives a reason. Equipment failure is what the Bureau of Reclamation's construction logs cite, specifically a malfunction in the cableway system used to lower the massive buckets of concrete into the canyon forms. That explanation is in the written record. It has been repeated in every popular history of the dam written since. And it is not false, exactly. The cableway did experience a mechanical interruption during that period. But the cableway was not why the pour stopped. I know this because the Bureau of Reclamation's own internal correspondence from that 11-day window describes, with considerable precision, something that had been found inside the canyon wall during the excavation of a drainage gallery in the lower canyon, and that a hastily assembled team of Army Corps of Engineers specialists had been brought in to examine. The correspondence describes what they found, and the correspondence was not, until very recently, something that anyone outside a small number of government offices had read. I came to this through a procurement audit, not a dramatic starting point, but it is where the trail begins. I was working through the federal contracting records for the Boulder Canyon project, the legal and administrative framework that authorized and funded Hoover Dam, specifically trying to understand the relationship between the Bureau of Reclamation, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the 6 companies consortium that held the primary construction contract. The relationship between those 3 entities is more complicated than the standard dam histories suggest. And understanding the contracting architecture is the only way to understand why certain decisions were made the way they were, and why certain records ended up where they did, rather than where they should have. In the course of pulling those records from the National Archives facility in Riverside, California, I found a series of internal Bureau of Reclamation memoranda from August and September of 1933 that were filed not under the standard Boulder Canyon Project series, where a researcher looking for construction records would naturally look, but under a separate administrative series used for what the Bureau called special consultations, cases where external expertise had been brought in to assess conditions outside the normal parameters of the project. By the time you reach the end of what I am going to tell you, you will understand that the 11 days had nothing to do with the cableway. What the excavation crews encountered in the lower canyon drainage gallery in late August of 1933, and what the Army Corps team spent 11 days examining and documenting before the pour resumed, was structural, physical, present in the rock in a way that the construction engineers on site did not have a framework for interpreting, and that the Bureau officials who received the Army Corps report handled in a manner that tells you a great deal about how seriously they took it. The payoff of this story is not what was found in a dramatic sense. The payoff is the decision that was made about what to find it, and what that decision required the people who made it to believe. Consider what the lower canyon looked like during that phase of construction, because the physical context is the only thing that makes the Army Corps report legible. By the late summer of 1933, the excavation of the canyon walls and floor was essentially complete. The Black Canyon had been blasted, drilled, and scraped to a depth and profile that would allow the dam's concrete to bond directly to native rock. This was the fundamental engineering premise of the entire project. The dam would not rest on a foundation in the conventional sense. It would be keyed into the canyon walls, locked to the rock on both sides, so that the mass of the structure and the pressure of the reservoir behind it would be transmitted directly into the canyon geology. For that to work, the geology had to be what the pre-construction surveys said it was. Sound volcanic basalt and andesite, dense and uniform, with no significant voids or fracture systems that would compromise the bond. The pre-construction surveys had said it was. The excavation had proceeded on that assumption. And the drainage gallery in the lower canyon, a tunnel driven horizontally into the canyon wall to manage groundwater during construction, had encountered something the surveys had not predicted. The Bureau memoranda describe it initially in the language of a routine anomaly report, An unexpected void encountered during gallery excavation. Dimensions to be determined. Structural assessment required. This is the language used for the kind of thing that happens regularly on large excavation projects. A pocket of softer material, a fracture zone, an air pocket left by ancient volcanic activity. Any of these would have been handled by the on-site engineering team without requiring a special consultation or an 11-day halt. What converted a routine anomaly into a special consultation is stated in the second memorandum, dated 3 days after the first. The void is of dimensions inconsistent with natural geological formation and exhibits characteristics that the on-site team cannot account for within the known geology of the Black Canyon Formation. Cannot account for. In a Bureau of Reclamation internal memorandum from 1933. About a construction project that had been the most thoroughly surveyed public works site in American history to that point. And that is the part I keep returning to. Because the Bureau of Reclamation in 1933 was not an agency given to drama or imprecision. Its internal correspondence is the driest reading imaginable. Tables of concrete yield, cableway load calculations, labor hours by crew designation. The men who wrote these memoranda wrote about cubic yards and tensile strength. They did not write cannot account for about geological features unless they genuinely could not account for them. And the institutional cost of admitting that on a project of this scale and public visibility was high enough that the phrase would not have been used unless it was the only accurate phrase available. The Army Corps team that arrived in late August of 1933 consisted, according to the consultation request filed with the Corps' Southwest Division Office, of 4 men, a structural geologist, a military engineer with experience in underground fortification assessment, a surveying specialist, and a 4th individual listed in the consultation request only by rank and last name. A designation I have not been able to trace to a personnel file, which is itself unusual for Army Corps records from this period, where personnel assignments are typically well documented. The 4-man team spent 11 days in the Lower Canyon Drainage Gallery. Their report, submitted to the Bureau of Reclamation on the 12th day, runs to 31 pages. I have read 22 of those pages. The remaining 9 are in a section of the document that was separated from the main report at some point after filing. The binding shows evidence of pages having been removed, and I have not been able to locate them in any archive I have accessed. The 22 pages I have read describe the void in the canyon wall with the precision you would expect from a military engineering assessment. Dimensions, geometry, surface characteristics of the interior walls. The structural geologist's analysis of the rock matrix surrounding the void and the relationship between the void and the surrounding formation. What the report describes, in those 22 pages, is a space inside the canyon wall approximately 60 feet long, between 8 and 12 feet wide at its widest point, and between 7 and 9 feet in height, dimensions that vary because the interior is not uniform, but that fall within those ranges throughout. The space runs roughly parallel to the canyon face, set back approximately 40 feet from the surface at its nearest point. This is the part I keep returning to. Because the dimensions themselves are only the beginning of what the report describes, the structural geologist section, which begins on page 9 of the document, states that the void's interior surfaces do not present the characteristics of a naturally formed cavity. A natural void in volcanic rock, formed by gas escape during cooling, or by the dissolution of mineral deposits over geological time, or by tectonic fracturing, presents with specific surface textures, specific profiles of irregularity, specific relationships between the void geometry and the surrounding rock structure. The structural geologist lists these expected characteristics and then states, for each one, what the gallery void presented instead. The interior surfaces are described as having irregularity of profile inconsistent with natural formation processes. The geometry of the space, the relationship between the floor, the walls, and the ceiling is described as presenting a consistent angular relationship that the geologist characterizes as not occurring in naturally formed voids in this rock type, or, to his knowledge, in any volcanic rock type he has examined. The floor of the space, he writes, is level. Not approximately level, the way a natural floor might be when erosion or deposition creates a relatively flat surface. Level, in the way that a worked surface is level, with a consistency of plane across the full length of the space that he states he cannot explain through any natural process he is aware of. The military engineers section follows. His assessment focuses on the structural relationship between the void and the canyon wall, specifically, on whether the void represents a risk to the bonding of the concrete to the native rock, which was the engineering question that had triggered the consultation in the first place. His conclusion on that question is straightforward. The void, properly grouted and sealed, does not present a structural risk to the dam. That conclusion allowed the pour to resume. It is the practical answer to the practical question, and it is presumably why the Bureau accepted the report and moved forward. But the military engineers section also contains a passage that goes beyond the structural risk assessment. And this is the passage that I have read most carefully and returned to most often. He writes that in conducting his structural assessment, he made a series of measurements of the void's interior geometry, and that the measurements produced results he is including in the report because he believes they are relevant to a complete understanding of what has been found, though he acknowledges they fall outside his professional competence to interpret. The measurements, he writes, indicate that the space has interior proportions, the ratios of length to width to height, and the angular relationships between the surfaces that correspond to proportional systems he has encountered in his study of historical fortification design, specifically in the underground construction traditions of pre-Roman Mediterranean cultures, though he emphasizes that he is not suggesting a connection and is including the observation solely because he believes it should be part of the record. Pre-Roman Mediterranean construction proportions. Inside a canyon wall in the Nevada desert. In a document filed with the Bureau of Reclamation in 1933, the Surveying Specialists section maps the void in relation to the canyon face and to the surrounding geological structure. His maps are in the report. They show the void's position relative to the drainage gallery and to the canyon wall profile, and they show something that neither the geologists section nor the engineers section had explicitly addressed. The void is not alone. The surveying section identifies, through drilling records and acoustic testing conducted during the 11 days, evidence of at least 2 additional spaces in the canyon wall within 300 feet of the first, both inaccessible from the drainage gallery, and both of similar dimensions based on the acoustic data. The surveying specialist notes that he cannot confirm the characteristics of these additional spaces through direct examination, and that his acoustic methodology has a margin of error he quantifies at plus or minus 15% on the dimension estimates. He recommends further investigation. There is no record, in any document I have found, that further investigation was conducted. Consider what the Hualapai and Southern Paiute oral traditions say about the Black Canyon. Because those traditions existed before the first survey team set foot in the canyon in the 1920s. And they are not trivial on the subject of what the canyon walls contain. The ethnographic record, specifically the surveys conducted by the Smithsonian Bureau of American Ethnology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, before any federal development of the Colorado River was proposed, describes traditions among both peoples of places within the canyon that were understood to be entrances to older spaces, spaces not made by the living and not to be disturbed. The ethnographers who recorded these traditions treated them as spiritual geography, the kind of sacred site knowledge that anthropology of that era categorized and moved past. The Bureau of Reclamation's pre-construction survey records do not reference them. The Army Corps consultation report does not reference them. I am not in a position to say these traditions describe the drainage gallery void. I am saying they describe the Black Canyon as a place that was already understood to contain things that were not surface geology, and that this understanding predated the federal project by at least a century of recorded oral tradition. The report was received by the Bureau on the 12th day. The concrete pour resumed on the 13th. The drainage gallery void was grouted and sealed as the military engineer recommended. The dam continued to rise. It was completed in 1935, 2 years ahead of schedule and under budget, the achievement that defined it for public purposes, and that ensured no one in an official capacity had any reason to revisit the questions the 1933 consultation had raised. The dam worked. The bond held. The reservoir filled. And the report was filed in the Special Consultation Series, where a researcher looking for construction records would not naturally look, and where it remained for the better part of a century. There is a second document. This one did not come from a federal archive. It came from the estate sale of a man named Warren Billings Craft, a civil engineer who worked on the Hoover Dam project from 1931 to 1935 as part of the 6 company's field staff, and who died in Las Vegas in 1979. His professional papers were sold at a state auction in 1981, purchased in bulk by a private collector of Western Americana, who later donated them to a university library in Arizona that I will not name specifically, at the donor's request, because the donation was made with a condition that the materials not be cited in ways that might attract significant outside attention before the library's own catalog is complete. I have seen the relevant document. It is a personal journal entry written by Kraft in September of 1933, describing a conversation he had with one of the Army Corps men during the 11-day halt. Kraft does not name his source. He describes him as a quiet man, an engineer, who had come down from the gallery on the 9th day and sat with the construction workers at the mess tent without talking for a long time before he said anything. And what he said, according to Kraft's journal, was this: that whatever had made the space in the canyon wall had known what it was doing, and that it had been a very long time ago, and that he was glad it was someone else's job to decide what to say about it. This is not an isolated case in the American West. Between 1920 and 1960, the federal construction programs that reshaped the Western landscape, the dam projects, the highway systems, the military installation excavations, produced a series of internal reports describing underground anomalies that were assessed, sealed, and filed without public disclosure. I have found documentation of 7 such cases. The details vary. The administrative pattern does not. Anomaly encountered. Specialist team assembled. Assessment conducted. Practical question answered, allowing construction to proceed. Deeper questions not answered or not asked formally, because the project had a schedule and a budget and a political context that did not accommodate open-ended investigations into things that could not be explained. The practical and the profound were separated at the point of the report, and the practical went into the construction record, while the profound went into the special consultations file. And the special consultations file was not where anyone looked when they wrote the history. What was poured over the drainage gallery void in 1933 is now inside the body of Hoover Dam. It has been there for 90 years. The concrete that bonded to the canyon wall on either side of the sealed space has been holding back the Colorado River since 1935, performing exactly as the military engineer's report said it would. The engineering question was answered correctly. The void is not a structural problem. It has never been a structural problem. And because it has never been a structural problem, there has been no engineering reason to go back, and no one with the authority to authorize a return visit has chosen to provide a different kind of reason. What was lost is harder to name here than in some of these cases. Because nothing was physically removed or destroyed, the void is still there, behind the grouting and the concrete, behind 90 years of river pressure and the weight of a structure that remains one of the largest ever built. The space that took 11 days to examine is still a space. What was lost is the thread, the connection between the examination and any subsequent inquiry that might have followed it. The Army Corps team went down, spent 11 days, wrote 31 pages, and came back up. 9 of those pages are missing. The surveying specialist recommended further investigation. No further investigation was conducted. The quiet engineer sat in the mess tent and said what he said to Warren Craft, and Warren Craft wrote it in his journal, and the journal went to an estate sale in Las Vegas in 1981. And the trail ends there unless someone with access and authority decides it should not. If you know someone who has stood on the observation deck at Hoover Dam and looked at the canyon walls on either side and wondered, the way you wonder sometimes at things built at that scale, what the rock remembers that the concrete does not, share this with them. The report exists. The journal entry exists. The special consultations file exists, though it is not complete. What happened during those 11 days was documented by 4 men who were brought in specifically to document it. And what they wrote was received and acted on practically and filed. The practical question was answered. The other questions were not. They are still there, behind the grouting, in the dark, where the canyon wall and the concrete meet.